The minivan groaned under the weight of laughter and camping gear as it trundled along the dusty path, carving a line through the dense forest that bordered Lake Mirwood. Tom, gripping the steering wheel, glanced in the rearview mirror at his friends. Mike and Susan were tangled in a playful argument, while Connor and Philip were lost in a world of music, their headphones on. Lena sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the passing trees, their shadows dancing like wraiths in the late afternoon sun. "Almost there, guys," Tom announced, his voice barely cutting through the cacophony of excitement. The minivan lurched as it hit a pothole, eliciting a chorus of mock protests. "Man, your dad's van has seen better days," Connor remarked, removing his headphones. "It's got character," Tom replied with a grin. "And it's got us this far, hasn't it?" The van emerged from the canopy of trees into a clearing. The sight of Lake Mirwood, with its glass-like surface reflecting the reddening sky, drew a collective gasp. They had arrived at their weekend escape, a secluded spot far from the reaches of hectic city life. As they began unloading, the air was filled with the scents of pine and fresh water. The tranquility was a stark contrast to their urban routines. Setting up the tents, Mike joked about his lack of outdoor skills, and Susan playfully scolded him for his clumsiness. As dusk approached, the lake transformed. The water, now a dark mirror, seemed to hold secrets in its depths. The trees, once friendly in daylight, cast long, ominous shadows. A sense of isolation crept over Lena. She shivered, not from cold, but from a creeping sensation she couldn't quite place. "Hey, Lena, you okay?" Tom asked, noticing her distant look. "Yeah, it's so different out here. Quiet, eerie," she replied, forcing a smile. "Perfect for some ghost stories later, huh?" Tom winked, trying to lighten the mood. The campfire crackled to life, casting a warm glow against the encroaching darkness. They gathered around, the light flickering across their faces, creating a play of light and shadow. As they roasted marshmallows and shared laughs, the forest around them seemed to lean in, as if eager to listen. "Let's make it interesting tonight," Philip suggested. "Let's each share the spookiest story we know. Set the mood for our little adventure." Their laughter faded as they settled into a comfortable silence, the only sounds the gentle lapping of lake waters and the occasional snap of the fire. One by one, they began their tales, each story darker than the last, weaving a tapestry of folklore and urban legends. As the night deepened, so did the sense of unease. The stories, once a source of amusement, now seemed to echo in the stillness of the woods, as if awakening something long dormant. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that unseen eyes were watching them from the darkness beyond the firelight. Just as the final story ended, a sudden rustling from the bushes sent a shockwave of silence through the group. They stared into the dark thicket, hearts racing. A small rabbit emerged, its eyes glinting in the firelight, and hopped away into the night. Laughter erupted, a release of pent-up tension, but Lena's laughter was hollow. She couldn't shake the feeling that this weekend would be more than they had bargained for. As they settled into their tents, the sounds of the night enveloped them, a symphony of whispers and creaks, as if the forest itself was alive and breathing. In her tent, Lena lay awake, listening to the eerie chorus of the nocturnal woods. She thought of the stories they had shared, each a seed of fear now planted in her mind. Little did she know their own story was just beginning, one that would make their ghost tales pale in comparison. Morning at Lake Mirwood was shrouded in a dense fog, the kind that seemed to swallow sound and make the familiar world feel alien. The group awoke to a muted, gray world. The cheerful vibrancy of the previous day now hidden behind a veil of mist. Tom was the first to notice something was amiss. He had gone to the minivan to retrieve some fishing gear when he realized the vehicle was unresponsive. Turning the key in the ignition only produced a series of hollow clicks. "Guys, we have a problem," Tom called out, his voice tinged with urgency. The others, roused from their morning routines, gathered around the minivan. Tom tried the ignition again, but the car remained lifeless, an inanimate hulk in the midst of the misty woods. "Great, just great," Mike muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Now what?" Tom popped the hood, peering into the mechanical labyrinth, though his knowledge of car engines was rudimentary at best. "Maybe the battery's dead?" Susan suggested, her brows furrowed in concern. "Or something worse," Connor added grimly. The isolation of their campsite, once a source of excitement, now felt ominous. Cut off from the outside world, with no cell service and now no transportation, a sense of vulnerability crept in. Lena, who had been quiet, spoke up. "There's a village nearby, isn't there? Maybe someone there can help." Tom nodded. "Yeah, it's a couple of miles away. We can walk there." The decision was made. Tom and Lena volunteered to go to the village while the others would stay at the camp. As Tom and Lena set off, the fog seemed to close in around them. The path ahead obscured. Their footsteps were muffled, the world around them eerily silent, except for the distant melancholy call of a loon. The further they walked, the more Lena felt a growing sense of dread. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes in the fog. Every rustle in the underbrush set her heart racing, her mind conjuring images of unseen watchers. "Creepy, isn't it?" Tom said, his voice low. "Like we're walking into a ghost story." Lena forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Let's just hope we find someone in the village willing to help." Finally, the trees began to thin and the outlines of buildings emerged from the fog. They had reached the village, a collection of old, weather-beaten houses that looked like they had sprung up from the very earth. A sense of relief washed over Lena, quickly replaced by a new unease. The village was quiet, too quiet. There were no signs of life, no people going about their day. The windows of the houses were dark, the doors closed. Tom approached the first house and knocked, no answer. He tried the next and then the next, but it was the same each time. Silence. "They can't all be gone, can they?" Lena whispered, her voice tinged with fear. Tom shook his head, his expression grim. "There has to be someone here. Let's keep looking." They continued through the village, the sense of being watched growing stronger with each step. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the growing terror within her. As they approached the village store, the only sign of life, a feeling of unease settled over them. The store was an old, rickety structure, its windows dusty and obscured. A faded sign creaked on its hinges, the words "General Store" barely legible. Tom pushed open the door, the bell above letting out a shrill ring that seemed to echo endlessly in the empty street. Inside, the air was stale, the shelves lined with goods that seemed as old as the village itself. Behind the counter stood a woman, her appearance as weathered as the village. Her eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to bore into them, a knowing glint within their depths. "Can I help you?" Her voice was a dry rasp, sending a shiver down Lena's spine. Our car broke down near the lake. We were hoping to find some help here," Tom explained, trying to maintain a steady voice. The woman's gaze lingered on them for a moment longer than comfortable. "No mechanics here, but you might find some help at the next town over. It's a day's walk from here." Tom's heart sank. A day's walk meant they would be stranded for much longer than anticipated. The woman leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to fill the room. "You best be leaving before nightfall. The village, it's not safe after dark." The warning, delivered with such casual certainty, struck a chord of fear in both Tom and Lena. They exchanged a glance, the same thought mirrored in their eyes. They needed to leave, now. "Why should we leave before nightfall?" Tom asked, his voice betraying a hint of skepticism mingled with fear. The woman's lips curled into a knowing, almost mocking smile. "This village," she began, her voice a raspy whisper, "is not what it seems. When the sun sets, things change. The night here doesn't take kindly to strangers." Lena felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "What happens at night?" she pressed, her curiosity battling her fear. The woman leaned closer, and for a moment, Lena thought she saw a flicker of sorrow in her eyes. "The shadows move and the forgotten ones walk. You do well to heed an old woman's advice and leave before the darkness embraces you." Her words hung in the air like a curse spoken in an ancient tongue. Tom and Lena exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the warning pressing down on them. "Thank you," Tom said, attempting to keep his voice steady. "We'll be quick." The woman nodded, turning away to resume her work, leaving them standing amidst the relics of the past. Tom and Lena hurriedly gathered the few supplies they needed and made their way to the counter. As Tom and Lena stepped out of the general store, the atmosphere of the village had undergone a subtle yet unnerving transformation. The sun, now just a dimming orb on the horizon, cast long, ominous shadows across the narrow streets, and the air was heavy with an unspoken warning. "The saleswoman was right, this place feels off," Lena whispered, her eyes darting nervously from one shadowy corner to another. Tom nodded, his usual confidence replaced by a palpable tension. "Yeah, let's get back to the others quickly. I don't like this." As they hurried along the village's main street, Lena's gaze was drawn to a window of a nearby house. There, silhouetted against the fading light, was the figure of a man. He was motionless, just staring out at them with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "Tom, look," she murmured, tugging at his sleeve. Tom glanced over, his steps faltering as he saw the figure. "What is he?" Before he could finish, his attention was caught by another window where a woman stood, her eyes fixed upon them, unblinking, her expression unreadable in the twilight. A sense of dread enveloped them as they realized that each house they passed harbored silent watchers. Eyes peered out from behind curtains and through half-open shutters, each gaze heavy with an indescribable menace. Tom and Lena quickened their pace, their footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. The feeling of being watched intensified, an invisible weight pressing down on them. "This is wrong, Tom. Why are they all staring?" Lena's voice trembled, her words punctuated by the rapid beat of her heart. "I don't know, but we can't stop now," Tom replied, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. As they neared the edge of the village, Lena glanced back and gasped. Behind them, at a distance, a crowd of villagers had gathered, moving slowly, almost methodically towards them. Their faces were obscured by the growing darkness, turning them into a mass of shadows that seemed to glide across the ground. "Tom, they're following us," she said, panic rising in her voice. Tom looked back, his face turning pale. "Run, Lena, run!" They broke into a desperate sprint, their breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. The sound of their footsteps was drowned out by the soft, eerie shuffle of the crowd behind them. As they neared the end of the village, a voice called out from a dimly lit house, "In here, quickly." In the dimly lit room, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and musty books, Frank moved about quietly, preparing tea in an attempt to bring some semblance of normalcy to the surreal situation. Tom and Lena sat at a small table, their minds racing with questions about the bizarre events unfolding around them. As Frank set the tea down, his hands were steady, but his eyes betrayed a deep, unspoken sorrow. He joined them at the table, his gaze lingering on the window before turning to his guests. "A few years back," Frank began, his voice a raspy whisper, "a stranger came to our village, claimed to be a doctor of sorts, rented a house on the outskirts. Some folks went to see him, Curious, I suppose. He paused, sipping his tea, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across his face. After that, things changed. Those who visited him, they weren't themselves anymore. By day, they seemed normal, but at night... His voice trailed off, a shudder running through him. "What happened at night?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They changed," Frank continued, his eyes darkening. "Became something else. Hunters in the dark." It wasn't long before newcomers to the village started disappearing. Some say they were caught, eaten, or worse, their souls taken, turning them into one of those things. Outside, a low, guttural groan echoed through the night, a sound that seemed to resonate with the very walls of the house. Lena's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively moved closer to Tom. "Why haven't you left?" she asked, her eyes fixed on Frank. Frank's face softened, revealing a deep, aching sadness. "My son," he said, the pain in his voice palpable. "He was one of the first to visit that doctor. Now he's one of them. I've stayed, hoping to find a way to bring him back, to free him from whatever curse that man brought upon us." The room fell silent, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire. The story was almost too much to comprehend, a tale of horror and loss that seemed to seep into the very bones of the house. As dawn began to break, casting a pale light through the curtains, Tom and Lena knew they couldn't stay any longer. They thanked Frank, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of his unending vigil. "We should get back to our friends," Tom said, his voice firm despite the fear that lingered. Frank nodded, standing up to see them to the door. "Be careful," he warned. "The forest is not what it seems, and remember, they are still out there." Stepping outside, the early morning light was a stark contrast to the darkness of the night before. The village, shrouded in mist, seemed less menacing in the daylight, but the memory of the previous night's terror was fresh in their minds. The walk back through the dense woods was a journey laden with dread. Tom and Lena, their minds still reeling from Frank's harrowing tale, couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. The trees seemed to lean in closer, as if privy to their fears about the villagers they had seen in the village, their stares blank, yet filled with a haunting hunger. "Can you believe what Frank said about the villagers and his son?" Lena's voice trembled as she clutched her arms for warmth. "It's like something out of a horror story," Tom replied, his eyes scanning the thickening gloom. "But after what we saw, I don't know what to believe anymore." As they approached the campsite, a sense of foreboding washed over them. The once lively spot was now eerily quiet. The tent stood askew, and as they drew closer, the true horror of the scene unveiled itself. The ground was stained with dark smears of blood. Belongings were scattered and torn apart, a scene of chaos and violence. A gasp escaped Lena's lips. "Oh no, the others..." Tom, pale-faced, spotted something on the ground and picked it up. It was Connor's sneaker, its familiarity a stark contrast to the nightmarish scene. "What happened here?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Frantic, they called out for their friends, their voices desperate and cracking. "Mike, Susan, Connor, Philip." But only silence answered, a silence that seemed to mock their fear. They searched around the lake, their calls growing more frantic, but it was futile. The campsite was abandoned. Their friends vanished into thin air, leaving behind only traces of a struggle. As dusk settled in, dark clouds gathered overhead, foretelling a storm. Tom and Lena, defeated and terrified, returned to the minivan. Tom's hands shook as he tried the ignition, but the engine merely sputtered and died. "We're trapped," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper, as rain began to pelt the van. Sitting in the minivan, the storm raging outside, they heard it. A low, guttural moaning that rose above the sound of the thunder. It was coming from outside, drawing closer. The possessed villagers, their eyes hollow and movements jerky, emerged from the woods surrounding the minivan. Their groans were a chorus of the damned, their hands clawing at the windows, seeking entry. Tom and Lena huddled together, paralyzed with fear. The minivan became a small island in a sea of malevolence, the creature's fingers scraping against the glass like nails on a chalkboard. Then suddenly a bright light pierced the darkness, accompanied by the sound of a gunshot. It was Frank, his face set in grim determination, a shotgun in his hands and a flashlight cutting through the night. "Go now," he yelled, firing another shot into the air, drawing the attention of the possessed. Seizing the moment, Tom flung open the minivan door, pulling Lena with him. They sprinted into the woods, the sound of Frank's shotgun and the creature's wails fading behind them. They ran blindly, the forest a blur of shadows and rain, branches whipping against their faces. The storm overhead mirrored the chaos on the ground, lightning illuminating their path in brief, stark flashes. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew distant, but they didn't slow down, driven by a primal urge to survive. The campsite, the minivan, the horror they had witnessed, it all receded into the background as they plunged deeper into the dark heart of the forest. Tom and Lena ran, not knowing where they were headed, only that they needed to escape the nightmare that had claimed their friends, and now threatened to consume them as well. The night was alive with terror, and they were its latest prey. The forest was a blur around Tom and Lena as they ran, branches lashing at their faces, tearing at their clothes. The storm above mirrored their panic, thunder rumbling angrily, lightning flashing across the sky, momentarily illuminating their frantic escape. Lena's breaths came in ragged gasps, her legs burning with exertion. "Tom, I can't keep this up," she cried out, her voice strained with desperation. Tom reached for her hand, pulling her along. "We have to keep moving, Lena. They're right behind us." The howls and groans of the possessed villagers were a terrifying chorus that spurred them on, the sounds growing ominously closer. Every flash of lightning revealed glimpses of their pursuers, twisted, grotesque figures moving with unnatural speed through the trees. As they navigated the treacherous terrain, Lena stumbled over a root, her scream piercing the night. One of the possessed lunged at her, grasping her arm with a cold vice-like grip. Tom reacted instantly, tackling the attacker to the ground. They tumbled in a heap, a tangle of limbs and snarls. The crowd of possessed converged on them, their moans a cacophony of madness. "Run, Lena, run," Tom shouted, struggling beneath the weight of the possessed. Lena, tears streaming down her face, pushed herself to her feet and sprinted away, her heart breaking with each step. She ran blindly, branches whipping her face, her mind replaying Tom's sacrifice. Exhaustion overtook her, her legs giving way beneath her. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, her cries lost in the storm. "Tom, Tom," she repeated, her voice a haunting echo in the vast emptiness of the forest. Collapsed on the ground, Lena curled into a ball, holding her knees to her chest, succumbing to the overwhelming despair and fatigue. When Lena's eyes fluttered open, the sun was high in the sky, its rays filtering through the canopy. She was alone, her clothes dirty and wet, a stark reminder of the previous night's horror. With great effort, she stood, her body aching, and began to wander aimlessly through the woods, her mind numb with shock and grief. The events of the night played over in her head, a nightmare that refused to end. Stumbling onto a road, she walked slowly, her steps devoid of purpose. A police car appeared in the distance, driving towards her. The officer, seeing her disheveled state, stopped and stepped out of the car, concern etched on his face. "Miss, are you okay? What happened?" he asked, approaching cautiously. Lena's voice was a hollow whisper. "My friends, they're gone. The villagers, they took them." The officer's expression shifted to one of confusion and alarm. "Stay here. I'll call this in. We need to get you to safety." Numbly, Lena climbed into the back of the police car, her gaze vacant. As the car drove away, the forest receded into the background, but the shadows of what she had witnessed lingered, haunting her. The road stretched out before her, leading away from the nightmare, but the horror of what she had endured would remain with her forever.